Thank you, Ayo. We have with us this morning Samson Itodo, head of Yaga Africa. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily. Yeah,
Always a pleasure.
I'm not going to do the full details of Yaga. Anyways, you have released, you were in Kogi, yes. You were in Kogi, and your group was also in Bayelsa as well. For Kogi, you have called for a cancellation of votes as a result of the violence. Is that correct?
Yeah, not just violence, the disruption. First, in the pre-election period, because we deployed long-term observers in both states for about 8 weeks. And we did release reports in the pre-election period, first around the campaigns that were signposted by violence, arms stockpiling, recruitment of thugs, that made it very, very difficult under those circumstances to conduct elections. We did issue these threats. And beyond Yaga Africa, there were other civil society organizations, including INEC and the security agencies, who flagged these threats to the conduct of elections in both states. But the Electoral Commission and the security agencies assured Nigerians that they were going to neutralize these threats, and the citizens or the registered voters in this state will have the opportunity to exercise their franchise. But that didn't happen in Kogi State, even though you had elections in some places. But if you look at what we had in Kogi and in the build-up to the elections, I recall even on this program, I said the politicians in these two states, particularly in Kogi, were preparing for war, whilst INEC and other stakeholders were preparing for elections. And that's exactly what played out on November the 16th. The sporadic gunshots and, you know, the intimidation of voters and the violence and the deaths that were recorded in both states. And it's on the strength of that for us at the Yaga Africa and other civil society organization, we call for cancellation of the elections in Kogi State because it didn't meet the standards, and it's our considered opinion that the people in Kogi State were not given an environment and an opportunity to exercise their franchise. And that portends great danger for our democracy because despite, and I say this, if you look at what happened in Kogi, yes, the IG did assure Nigerians that they were going to secure the elections. He's also come out to say that some of these thugs had fake police uniforms, and some of them are fake police officers. But that raises a concern for our security architecture, that if we go into just an election that is a civil affair, for just a state in Kogi with just about 1.6 million registered voters, and our security agencies cannot protect citizens to exercise their franchise, it raises question about the state itself performing its own responsibility and where citizens feel unsafe. And I think at this point, we just need to condemn what happened in the post-election violence where a woman was killed and burnt down. And it just says a lot about our level of dehumanization and our approach towards electoral politics that is very, very defective. And the state cannot let this slide. And those who killed late Mrs. Abu need to be brought to book. And we expect that both the governor, who has condemned violence in some of his speeches and public statements, would actually wade in and ensure that whoever killed this woman is brought to book. Because as far as that situation is concerned, the state has failed its citizen. If you look at Bayelsa, for instance, yes, in Bayelsa, we didn't call for the cancellation of the Bayelsa elections. But what we said was that the results for Bayelsa, based on the official figures declared by INEC, didn't fall within the PVT, and that's the parallel vote tabulation estimate. And we detected manipulation
we'll come to Bayelsa shortly.
In the Bayelsa elections.
We'll come to Bayelsa shortly, but I want to stay on Kogi for a while because I remember that we spoke with the governor and governor-elect now, as declared by INEC, and he says that indeed there was violence. He's not going to deny that there was no violence, but that he says that it was only in one major local government or one major senatorial district. So he says, assuming without considering that in the whole of that particular senatorial district was marred, the elections there was marred by violence, that what about the remaining two senatorial districts where violence was not as prevalent or was not even recorded? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think the grounds that you have and the areas that you monitored provide sufficient grounds for cancellation of votes? he thinks otherwise.
First, it's important to place on record that whilst the IGA Africa did deploy, we deployed 500 observers to a random sample of 250 polling units. We were in all the 21 local governments of the state, virtually in majority of the wards. And we had stationary observers who stayed at a polling station where elections held and were not disrupted. And for places where elections were disrupted, they had to scamper for safety and for their lives. And Yaiga was not observing this election in isolation of other civil society organizations. There were other civil society organizations who were involved in this. And it wasn't just Yaiga that called for the cancellation. And if you look at the sum total of observers and credible observer groups, to be specific, it was widespread. We did flag about 62 critical incidents from just the sampled polling units where Yaiga deployed observers. And so it wasn't concentrated. I don't agree with the governor. There's evidence abound in public domain that these disruptions were widespread, and not just in Dekina local government. We also had Omala local government. You also had even in Olamaboro local government. They were widespread, and we had situation where election officials were abducted or kidnapped, and elections didn't hold in some polling stations, but results came out of those polling stations. And that's very, very problematic for our elections. And for us at civil society organization, we're not interested in the candidates. We're only interested in the process. Because the process, if the process is credible, the outcome thereof reflects the will of the people. And so I don't agree with the governor. And I think in the days ahead, we've got to come around to the table and ask ourselves critical questions about what do we want to get out of this democracy? What should our elections actually look like? And I believe that politicians can actually get political power without necessarily killing people, without necessarily mobilizing thugs, because what happened in Kogi is unacceptable and should be condemned, because it portends danger for subsequent elections. And then what you're beginning to see is people losing interest in democracy. And that has great problems for political legitimacy, because when you have public office manned by people who don't have legitimacy or have obtained legitimacy through guns and through violence, it's a recipe for political instability. And we've got to be very, very careful on how we engage. And that's why we've placed agency on the doorsteps of the president. The president has a constitutional responsibility to ensure the welfare and the safety and the protection of this 20 years of democracy. And he needs to show leadership. And it's there in our statement that the president has not shown leadership when it comes to electoral reforms. We had an opportunity before the elections. He didn't assent to the bill. He gave, yes, some reasons were valid, some were actually political. But we've got an opportunity now to begin to talk about electoral reforms. Yes, the Deputy Senate President had sponsored a bill with far-reaching recommendations. Can we accelerate this process? Because we have two off-cycle elections. But any electoral reform that does not have a component of reforming our ruling political elite will just be running round the circle, because these characters that we have in public office today, particularly those ones who prefer to use guns to get into office, we just need to evolve with a mechanism that limits their influence on the electoral process.
Quickly speak to Bayelsa, because you were saying that you didn't call for a cancellation there, but
yes,
you found out that the results that INEC declared did not quite tally with your parallel vote count.
Yes, absolutely. So for Bayelsa, we didn't call for cancellation, but we detected manipulation. And the truth is the APC candidate could have still won. However, there were manipulations in the results collation process. And so INEC official results says that the APC candidate would have gotten about 71% of the votes for the entire Bayelsa. And our PVT estimate shows that he was supposed to get between about 48 or 62%. And so INEC's result falls out of our margin of error. Therefore, there was some manipulation, and we detected manipulation, as well as that of the votes for the PDP candidate. And we flagged Southern Niger to be specific. In Southern Niger, for instance, the APC candidate, based on INEC results, got about 92% of the votes. But our PVT data clearly shows that he actually got about 81 or 82% of the votes. So it fell out of the margin of error, which suggests that the results were manipulated. That the PDP candidate in Southern Niger got 4% of the votes. But it fell also out of our margin of error, and based on the PVT estimate, the PDP candidate was to get 16% of the votes.
What are you recommending as a result?
Well, we've called for an audit of that election, but we also called for accountability, and INEC needs to ensure that if the collation officers or the presiding officers were responsible for manipulating the results, they should be brought to book to serve as a precedent. The second critical issue, and what the PVT has done, is to detect that elections didn't hold in about 25% of polling units. That raises a lot of questions because the Electoral Commission didn't provide opportunity for the people of those polling units to exercise their franchise. And if you don't hold elections in 25% of polling units and still you went ahead to make a return, that is very, very problematic for our elections.
Let me take this back to Lagos, and I want to ask Mr. Ogunye, Mr. GT Ogunye, if this report, as you know, detailed by so many civil society organizations, including Yaga Africa, will they hold any water in court, assuming candidates who feel aggrieved to take them to court?
Well, I'll answer your question this way. In the last presidential election petition, there are widespread speculation, nay, even belief about the fairness of the process. And then you go to court, and the court then say, look, you need to put forward legally admissible evidence to enable the court to adjudicate properly and perhaps grant you your relief. Yes, there may be popular opinion or views or even beliefs about what had happened in an election. For example, Yaga is calling for cancellation. Politicians will tell you, not even politicians, lawyers like me, you see, once INEC has concluded an election, INEC cannot cancel any election. It goes to the tribunal. So if the parties are not able to articulate their grievances in such a way as to make the tribunal to adjudicate and declare, for example, that election should be cancelled, there should be a rerun election, that's going to be the end of the matter.
Will the reports of the observers make any difference?
The reports are good for the observer, and the observers, we know, collaborate with INEC a great deal. In his exposition, and I'm talking about the Yaga's executive director, he talked about audit. Audit is not the business of the tribunal. That's the business of INEC. So these reports help INEC to do a review of its operations with a view to improving on its methodology, on its practice, on the conduct of the election. So to that extent, the reports are very good. And of course, the reports can also challenge those who claim they've gotten this mandate to a self-realization that, look, this is my election. You know, it was President Yaradua that came out forthrightly to say, look, I've been elected as a president, but I know that my election or the election that brought me to power was problematic. And that was an admission that led to greater things. The electoral reform, the ways panel, and so on and so forth. So these reports can indeed make actors, presuming that they can be conscientious, to realize that, look, we have a problem with the election, and then that perhaps may make them to be humble and then see how they can make amends, even in the way they govern, so that they don't govern with the braggadocio that they have one fantastic mandate and that they can do whatever they like. So it's a device for humility in governance, so to
All
speak.
right. So let's go back to the security aspect, especially breach in security and prosecution, because this is a big deal. If we fail to handle it at that point, then we eventually get elections that are not credible. Now, you look at the provisions in the law. For example, the law says that any person that threatens with violence or injury to compel another person to vote or refrain from voting will be imprisoned for a term of 3 years, and then there's a 1 million naira fine, either of them. So we have those laws, even though some people say we should probably upgrade the laws. But then when you go to court, you now hear INEC saying, the policeman that was in charge of this case did not give us enough evidence. I mean, we don't have the account of the person, for example. And at that point, I mean, you can't build a case on nothing. Everything fails. So it's INEC on one hand, and then you have the security agencies, their role. You are a forensic expert, you're a security expert, and apparently the role of security agents are a big deal when it comes to prosecuting offenses in the country. So for the police, how can they handle this better such that they have a great case? When you take it to court, you get a proper judgment.
Well, first of all, no crime can be successfully prosecuted without evidence. Evidence remains the only tool that the criminal justice administration system engages in driving home whatever arguments, either for the prosecution or the defense. Now, you also know that to be able to mine authentic evidence in any matter, the investigators remain a factor. If the man investigating a case has vested interest, certainly the evidence that will come out of that investigation is already compromised. And that's a moral issue. It brings me back to the issue of who truly are the ones committing the crimes. The Nigerian people commit the crime because they are party to the compromise. When the process says elections should be conducted by the electoral body INEC, and it's one man, one vote. And voting must not be induced. It must not be a situation where you're cajoled. People must not be influenced to make unacceptable choices. It should be voluntary. And we turn our eyes while people go around influencing the choice of the voters. That's a serious matter. Also going into the election, I recall that INEC did what they call the election security threat analysis, or, they tried to check the waters. And INEC came out with the position that, look, the threat level going into the election was very high. And that has remained the case across the years. INEC said even their own personnel going into the election, they were looking at 73% compromise already, because these are people drawn from the society. Let me just throw back certain things. An average Nigerian provides everything for himself. He's responsible for providing light for himself, water, and he sees an opportunity because his salary, his take home, we are struggling with 30.
But is that an excuse for anyone to perpetrate violence?
It lays the foundation.
But then we have the laws.
The laws will be implemented by people.
So are you saying that the law enforcement agents are compromised?
Definitely, we all know ourselves, we are Nigerians. They are compromised, either willingly or by compulsion.
Is that the foundation of what the IGP said when he said that fake policemen undermined the 6,241
It's worrisome for even the IG to admit that there were fake policemen. It's not it shouldn't have come from him, because it is his duty to provide security.
One of the issues that many people have been trying to wrap around their heads is the fact that in all of the cases that were mentioned, especially in Ajayi Crowther in Kogi, that they just heard sporadic gunshots, and some hoodlums came and took away some voting materials, and no one could record the presence of any security official?
No. Like I said, going into the election, INEC had raised an alarm that there were very high threats, security threats, and other factors going into the election. They were not prepared for that election.
Who?
The security agencies were not prepared.
Even with 66,000?
Even with INEC threat analysis, INEC issued a statement.
Okay. Let's take a short break. We'll be back to wrap this up. Please stay with us.
Well, Samson Itodo of Yaga Africa is still here with us. Our closing moment with him. You have heard there that only INEC has powers to cancel election. I beg your pardon, the courts. Only the courts have the powers. INEC has no powers to cancel elections. How does your recommendation stand in the face of that? Do you look at the laws and what is possible before you make recommendations?
Just 2 quick points. So when we talk about electoral reforms, we don't just mean legal reforms. The administrative reforms that INEC needs to undertake internally to deepen its own capacity to deliver credible elections, but also raise the integrity quotient of our elections, and that's very critical. And there's also the legal reforms that needs to be undertaken. These elections have come, they are not a good standard for us. We've got to identify what are the lessons from these elections and see how in the discourse on electoral reforms we mainstream some of those lessons. But more importantly, electoral reform has to be on the front burner of public discourse as well as the National Assembly, and the President needs to play a leadership role. The second point is
I'm
the
afraid
audit.
we have to hold it there.
INEC needs to audit these elections, very critical.
Well, Samson, thank you so much for being a part of our program.
Always a
for
pleasure.
Always coming
Always a
when we
pleasure.
call. He is the head of Yaga Africa. It's back to you now, Ayo and Coyote.
Well, thank you very much, Maokwe. So let me ask you pointedly, Mr. Jitiogoye. What do we need to do through the laws, or whichever way, to stop entirely electoral offenses, especially electoral violence?
Look, we can be talking about electoral reforms, and stakeholders can be talking about that. But shouldn't we be talking about reform of government, reform of our law enforcement processes, reform of our judiciary? I tell you, for example, you have section 285 of the Constitution, subsection 2, saying that an election tribunal shall be established in each state, meaning that once an election tribunal is to decide a petition, it has to be decided in every state. But we are now aware that some tribunal will leave their state on the ground of alleged insecurity and go to Abuja, go to other states to determine election petition.
We should be having a more expanded conversation.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Final words, Mr. Ononugo. What do we need to do to stem the tide of electoral violence?
I think we need to reinvent our definition for democracy in Nigeria. We also need to hold the leadership accountable. We have people involved in the process that are questionable. The criminal justice administration system should be empowered and should be positioned to become more effective.
Okay.
When people are punished for doing the wrong things, the people who have intentions will take a cue.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Alfred Ononugo, security consultant and a forensic investigator. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
As well as Mr. Jitiogoye, a legal practitioner. Thank you so much for your time. Well, would have loved very much to take your messages, but please keep them coming on, because one of these days, who knows, we'll probably spend a whole episode taking all of your message. Until then, my name is Ayo Makide. Have a wonderful day.
And I'm Kairo Kikelu. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. From here in Abuja, I'm Maokwe Ogun Yusuf.